You just mentioned the rule makers. I want to ask, because now some people are saying whoever has the biggest fist gets to decide. Isn't this just the law of the jungle, right? Many people in Europe are also saying for this reason that international law is being disregarded. Whenever Trump says he wants to attack someone, he just does it. So, how do you view this issue?
First of all, let me ask, did the jungle originally have rules? Or, to put it another way, let's not talk about all of international law, just the United Nations. The UN has an Economic and Social Council. Let me give you the latest development. There is a country that was chosen by a UN vote to become an important member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. I think that's what it is.
Vice chair or something like that.
A vice chair position like this, think about it. Is this country an economically developed, democratic, stable nation where people are happy? Let me tell you, everyone, this is actually one of the worst countries in the world. This country is a brutal totalitarian regime, a strictly controlled totalitarian regime. Which specific one is it? It is not China, but rather Iran. In the very recent and intense US-Iran conflict, the government of Iran just killed more than 40,000 of its own protesting civilians. And yet the United Nations actually accepted them, even letting Iran come out to represent the face of justice in the international community today. Now, some people are currently criticizing that the world is not a multipolar world, speaking as if the world should naturally and inherently be multipolar, including a formal G2 structure. But the real problem is there really aren't that many countries in the world right now that are truly clear-headed. I know I'm being very blunt and direct here. I imagine some of our viewers may not actually live in the United States. So when I say that many countries are not clear-headed, maybe some viewers won't be happy about it at all and will say something like, our government is still clear-headed, so regardless of whether it's the German, British or French government, I can say that except for the Japanese government, it is currently clear-headed. Taiwan's present, the ruling party is clear-headed, but the remaining countries, the so-called democracies, which other countries in the democratic camp are still clear-headed? Tell me. My standard for being clear-headed is whether they understand the US-China Cold War and the current global landscape. In the last century, during the US-Soviet Cold War, there was not a single person in the world who did not know about it. But in this century, the US-China Cold War has been going on for 6 years now, and about 95% of governments in the world are still operating as usual. So they are using a mindset from before the Cold War, or from before the US-China Cold War was ignited by China to perceive the world. That is to say, how should I put it? Their mindset is at best outdated, even obsolete. Because of this, many of the arguments put forward by various countries are simply out of touch. Let me give you an example. When China began openly claiming the high seas in the South China Sea as its own, did the United Nations play any role? No, it didn't. Then did the majority of countries in the world who care about international maritime law and the condemnation of abuses of public authority ever demand that the Chinese Communist Party withdraw and dismantle the newly built military bases at sea and return the high seas to the world? Because those high seas are also the main maritime routes for half the world. China wants to turn them into what it calls a deep-sea fortress for its strategic nuclear submarines. Such a serious matter, because in the future, that area could become a base for launching long-range intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads. If China says blockade, then it's blockaded. At this point, shouldn't the world demand that China not do this? Has any country ever stood up? No. Even Taiwan just follows behind the US and makes a few token statements. The only country that can make China even slightly wary is the United States. So, as I said earlier, apart from the US and Japan, who have clear minds, most other countries are clueless. If you let confused people decide what the world should do, it's best not to listen to them. He simply has absolutely no right whatsoever to say such things. He does not even begin to comprehend or understand the complex events that are currently unfolding in the world today. If you don't believe me, you should consider inviting French President Emmanuel Macron onto your show to discuss it. Let me have a conversation with him. I'll ask him a few questions, and I believe I'll stump him. The same goes for the British Prime Minister or any European government leader. They're all confused, and what's worse is that they pretend to understand. That's the real trouble with this world. Behind their confusion, there are actually many vested interests at play, and they refuse to admit that only the United States is currently able to maintain the world order. For example, look at the current situation in the Middle East. If the United States doesn't get involved and just lets things drag on at the United Nations, right now in the UN Economic and Social Council, Iran calls the shots. Iran says, we want to dominate the Middle East and control 70% of the world's oil. I'll control and choke off all your countries. If I say you get a barrel, you get a barrel. Otherwise, you won't get a single drop. Do you think that's expensive or not? If Iran, with such a hardline theocratic regime, really wanted to do this, they could actually pull it off. And in fact, they have done it before. Recently, they've also choked off other countries. So, in this kind of situation, is the United Nations useful at all? Not in the slightest. And is the International Court of Justice useful? Not at all. The International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled years ago that part of the South China Sea belongs to the Philippines. Those 200 nautical miles of territorial waters, the Chinese government just said, forget it, we don't recognize that. If they don't recognize it, then they just don't recognize it. The world says, you don't recognize it? Fine, we acknowledge that you don't recognize it. And they maintain their relationships with European countries and the United States. So, during this recent US-Iran conflict, the leaders of the three major European countries, as a result, many of them rushed to Beijing. Why? To seek a way out, thinking that in a multipolar world, we, the important countries of Europe, together with Beijing, join forces with us so we can solve the Middle East issue together. Don't let Trump keep attacking Iran, then the world will be at peace. But the problem is, are these presidents thinking clearly? They're not. Their heads are full of their own vested interests and calculations, but what they lack is a lightweight understanding of the international strategic landscape. To put it bluntly, these prime ministers should all go back to school, go to university and study international politics again. They should find a few professors who understand the US-China Cold War to teach them. Otherwise, they're simply not qualified. This is the current state of the world's leadership. So now, if a country's leader isn't thinking clearly, and its intellectual circles aren't thinking clearly either, the standard for whether someone is clear-headed is whether or not you understand this, that the world, at this very moment, has already entered the 6th year of the US-China Cold War. This US-China Cold War can become as serious as the US-Soviet Cold War back in the day. Right now, during the US-China Cold War, the United States is gradually pushing down the Chinese Communist Party, step by step, stripping away its authority to set the rules, forcing the CCP to once again become a rule follower. For example, this time when the US blocked Iranian ports, it wasn't just targeting Iran, it was also targeting China.
Actually, 90% of Iran's oil is currently exported to markets all around the world.
Is exported to China, right?
Yes.
China buys it. About 15% of China's oil is imported from Iran. Now, oil prices in China have already started to drop, and people at home are complaining loudly. At this point, the Chinese government doesn't want the economy to become paralyzed. On one hand, unemployment is high. On the other, prices are soaring, and ordinary people can't even get meat to eat. It's not that they can't afford it. It's that pig farmers in China are currently slaughtering their pigs because raising pigs is unprofitable. People are eating less and less meat because they have no money. After running out of money, they've cut back to the point where they just eat vegetables instead. In a country this big, where pork is the main source of protein and the primary meat dish, when people are eating less and less meat, that's a true sign of poverty among the population. And yet this government still is acting like a poor, militaristic regime, insisting on diverting a large portion of the economy's resources to develop national defense and compete with the United States. As for the current situation, to be perfectly honest with you, I won't even begin to talk about how much actual capability these so-called American allies in Europe really have to solve any major problems. I'll just say that I seriously doubt whether they even possess the fundamental cognitive ability to keep up with the complexities of American strategic thinking. What I specifically mean is their cognitive ability, not simply that their information is incomplete or insufficient, even though there is a massive amount of American information out there. They don't seem to realize that in today's vast internet world, there is actually very little information that remains hidden. Can actually be hidden from the public. At the very least, you can just use AI to search for it. For example, when I first started writing about the US-China Cold War, my earliest articles were published in the Epoch Times. I started writing in 2001, publishing on the websites of Radio Free Asia and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I wrote there for 6 or 7 years. Even now, you can't say that European countries are completely unfamiliar with this information. Otherwise, what are you China experts doing? But the problem is, it seems like people just don't know. The world is advancing at lightning speed, while European countries are just sitting back.
Still stuck.
At a certain.
Do you think it's because they don't know? Is it a matter of perception or a matter of values? For example, in the recent Iran war, the Western European countries, mainly Western European countries, did not support Trump attacking Iran. Do you think this is because they themselves don't believe Iran is that evil and deserves to be attacked? Or is it because they have issues with Trump personally? In other words, is it related to their values and their concept of political correctness, or is it related to their opposition to Trump himself? Why is it that they just don't support attacking Iran?
The two issues you mentioned are actually very cleverly intertwined. Let's first set aside the question of how European political leaders, intellectuals, so-called intellectuals, including the media, perceive Trump and the United States. I'll put that aside for now. Let me first briefly talk about something I mentioned earlier. The vested interests in European countries, which I didn't elaborate on before. Now, your question brings this issue to the forefront. What are the vested interests in European countries? To put it bluntly, well, Arabs are the vested interests in European countries. The reason is that their national populations have already become Middle Easternized or North Africanized. Southern European countries currently host very large and diverse populations of Arabs originating from North Africa. While Germany has a particularly significant and growing number of Arabs from various parts of the Middle East, there are now so many individuals that these local Arab communities can actively influence regional politics, run for various public offices, and maintain a very stable voter base with consistent voter support. It is often observed that Arabs naturally tend to support other Arabs within their communities.
But Iran also attacks the neighboring Arab countries. Haven't those Arab countries around Iran also been attacked by Iran?
They've been hit hard. Now, Turkey's unwilling to condemn it, because behind the interests of the Arabs in relation to Iran, there are also geopolitical factors like Turkey's Kurdish issue and so on. So the entanglements between them are not our concern. But there is one thing. European countries must yield to Arab powers, so European countries do not dare to condemn Iran. If they do, their domestic political parties might have to step down, as the Arabs would take action. There are millions of votes at stake. For example, if you support this party and you become president or prime minister, but then you say something that offends the Arabs, these millions of votes will instantly switch to your opposition party, and you're finished. That is the primary point to consider. Second, the birth rate among these Arabs is exceptionally and remarkably high, several times that of the local Europeans. As a result, they will soon form a significant demographic advantage purely through the sheer force of their growing numbers. Right? And then the advantage in votes will absolutely be theirs. So in the future, the Middle Easternization or North Africanization of European countries is their destiny. No country is willing to face this reality or speak openly about this issue. But if you look up the demographic structure is very clear. I remember, and I may have mentioned this on previous programs, that back in the early 1990s, when I lived in Paris for half a year, the apartment I rented was on the outer edge of Paris's inner ring in a district called Le Val-Royabel. At that time, it was a French neighborhood, but the landlord of the apartment I rented was Algerian. He had bought a dilapidated and run-down old house, and I rented it. At that time, it was an area where many Arabs lived. Located just to the west of Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport, there is a vibrant and very large Arab community. And from the early 1990s, all the way up until now, and even looking toward 2035, as the Arab population expanded, there was a phenomenon of difficult migration. They gradually moved from the airport area all the way into Paris, crossing the peripheric and starting to enter the city. The areas they reached, these neighborhoods, the entire area became Arabized, making it unlivable for the French. Everywhere you looked, all around you, people were eating naan. That North African
flatbread.
The entire food structure and cultural structure have changed. You can't even understand their language anymore because they're speaking Arabic. The French have gradually been pushed out by the incoming Arabs. That's why now in Paris, the French mostly live in the southern tip of the city center, while the north has already been given over to the Arabs. So half of Paris is now Arab. In the future, it's entirely possible that the mayor of Paris will be Arab, just like in London. Does the mayor of London dare to offend the Arabs now? No way, absolutely not. So in countries like this, once the Arabs have gained a demographic advantage, do you think they will uphold justice? They only care about their own vested interests, which is that they can't afford to offend these Arabs. Our country has become their domain. So what do European countries talk about abroad? Things like a multipolar world and human rights, right? But within their own countries, they actually have a very fundamental problem. The thing is, we can't have a military budget because all our money is given to the Arabs. Do I dare take it back? If I cut their social welfare, they'll revolt. Hasn't Paris already seen many uprisings? Why is it that in France, as soon as they cut social welfare, unrest breaks out immediately? So the government just gives in. It doesn't dare to cut, doesn't dare to make a move. So, as I just mentioned, one thing about European countries is whether you have the ability to judge international affairs. The ability I'm talking about is exactly this. They don't have it. They can't think clearly. A calm judgment, because half of their minds are controlled by Arabs. Those votes, the decisions are made by democratic countries, but behind the democracy of these countries, half of the people are from non-democratic countries. When it comes to a law, they don't talk to you about democracy anymore. And then, besides whether you can calmly judge things, there's still one question left in international affairs. Can you stay calm? Can you resolve international conflicts? Without national defense, how are you going to resolve any conflicts? If just talking could keep the world at peace, then this world would be too blissful. Everyone would just argue with each other. If neighbors never want to use knives, guns, kill, or set fires, then they're just neighbors. A community is great, but the problem is that in this world there are people who kill and set fires, and China has nuclear weapons. Every day they're expanding and increasing their numbers. Those aren't children's toys. They're not Legos. He really intends to use them. That's how he threatens people. Under the threat of nuclear weapons, how can you talk about things like human rights, stability, climate, or global warming? It all sounds lofty, but in reality, this is a question of values, just like you mentioned earlier when I talked about this with Gideon Rashman. The issue of values being bundled and twisted together is that European countries, as well as the United States, and regardless of whether it conflicts with Arab or American values, the theoretical foundation of American progressivism actually comes from Europe. Recently, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas passed away. He was still highly respected in Germany. The leftist values in America were imported from Germany, and Habermas was one of the godfathers of this ideology. France also has a group of ideological godfathers. For the French, the Germans, and Europeans in general, these figures are seen as spiritual leaders of their values. Their left-leaning tendencies, their fondness for communism, and their admiration for Maoism are all related to these influences. What they didn't anticipate was that Americans would actually vote the Democrats out of office. With that, they encountered huge problems, because the United States is a world power, economically, technologically, and militarily. In reality, the United States holds the position of the world's only superpower, and now the values of this sole superpower are completely at odds with yours. So what can you do? They have been brainwashing their own people for decades. After all these years, this so-called political correctness has become untouchable in Germany and France. Every ruling party has used these slogans, and every political leader has risen to power on the back of political correctness, regardless of what party they belong to. Now, they can't turn things around when it comes to values. The thing about values is, if there is no opposing value system or conflict in society, then everyone will just naturally go along with it. It's like if everyone says the sky is black, the sun is black. If that's what everyone says, then I would just accept it too. But if someone stands up and says, no, all of you are wrong, this is all a mess, and for example, the United States just happens to be a major power, the only superpower, when it comes to anything, what you say doesn't count. What they say is what counts. Take the Middle East issue, for instance. Why is it that European countries are unwilling to cooperate with the United States in participating in mine-clearing operations against Iran or in counter-blockades? Why? It's just as I mentioned earlier. Do European countries dare to do it? The UK, France, Germany, you all have navies, right? At least in name you do. If you check their defense budgets, there are allocations for the Navy, and they do have warships. But do they dare to go? The fact they have to admit is that they don't dare to go. If they did go, when they return home, there would be upheaval, rebellion. The Arabs would revolt. And there might even be Arab sailors on those warships. Would you dare let people in the British Navy who speak Arabic or are descendants of Arabs just mix in there? Would they dare eat and then go fight the Arabs? No, they wouldn't dare. Otherwise, the Arab soldiers might rebel and turn their guns around. So for European countries, they can only bow their heads to the Arab nations. But they are unwilling to admit this, especially since they still believe their values are correct. The more successful Trump is, the more the US secures its position as the world's only superpower. This makes it even harder for European countries because it means their world, second power, third power, fourth power, or even the G7, these statuses all refer to. This is something they find very hard to accept.
That's all wrong. Is that so? You mean?
Those values are wrong, proven wrong by the United States. The US hasn't really criticized them either. It has just expressed a different viewpoint. At least now, there's the Paris Climate Agreement, which has now been rejected by the United States. As a result, the US has denied the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States withdrew twice. When Trump was elected, they withdrew twice. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement has basically become void. Now, look around the world. Where else is there any meeting about implementing the Paris Climate Agreement? Because that meeting was just another way to divide up the spoils with Germany and France involved. They wanted to sell this green carbon credit, which is basically making money out of thin air by selling air. But now this whole scheme has fallen apart. This is the so-called international rule-making power of the United States, only when Biden gives the nod. The Paris Climate Agreement is something that everyone has to follow. Every country has to talk about it. Green energy. Now that this value system around carbon reduction is gone, Germany has started to resume nuclear energy. They're burning wood, digging up coal. Everything is back. And now Chancellor Merz has started to criticize former Chancellor Merkel. So as representatives of political correctness, they're now fighting over values among themselves. In this situation, European countries are all about these values. Leftist values prevail. They can't shake off this burden, but at the same time, they're constantly being pushed by the United States, pushed forward in the international community, advancing the establishment of international rules. They're being cornered, feeling that sense of unwillingness. That kind of jealousy is a knot in the hearts of European leaders that's very hard to resolve. They just can't get over it. Take Macron, for example. Recently, he suggested to Trump that they hold another G7 meeting to discuss the Middle East issue. Trump didn't respond, but in reality, Macron was just trying to boost his own standing by leveraging the United States. As far as I know, we're already nothing now. We're just a second-rate country with no national defense capability and no ability to solve our own domestic issues. Our economy is hopeless, high-tech and advanced technology have nothing to do with us. We're simply becoming a backward second-rate country. But they just can't admit this fact, so what can they do? Let me tell you, I criticize the United States, then bring out a set of leftist rhetoric and try to set some traps for Trump. For example, if you talk about the East, I'll talk to you about the West, and in the end, it comes back to what I said earlier. Do they have a clear mind? It's possible to judge the trends of the world, but they pretend not to. The reason is, if you claim to see everything clearly, in the end, it's the US and China that decide the direction of the 21st century world and the theoretical trends of global issues. And the winner can only stake their life on it. So when you ask what these European countries are trying to gain by currying favor with China, the answer is they gain nothing at all. At this point, if you make them admit their mistakes, then whichever political party admits fault, that party will have to step down. Whichever president admits fault, that president will have to step down. Step down. Macron can't slap himself in the face or pull himself up by his own hair and leave the earth. It's just that simple. So, as we can clearly see leading up until this very day, in fact, this ongoing and complex geopolitical conflict between the United States and Iran has continued to be played out on the global stage. Furthermore, another critical observation to make is that the increasingly fictitious and fragile nature of various European countries has also been starkly exposed for the world to see.
I saw that when Trump was being interviewed by Fox News, he said something that, when you think about it carefully, is actually quite profound. He said, of course, he was talking about NATO, referring to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He said, "We get zero help from them. NATO doesn't help us at all." He said that on the issue of Iran, they don't stand with us. So in the future, when it comes to an even bigger issue, they also won't stand with us. My personal interpretation is that this even bigger issue he mentioned was originally a much bigger subject. I think what he's referring to is the confrontation between China and the US, or as some say, the confrontation in the Taiwan Strait. So what he's saying is, if there is such a confrontation between China and the US in the future, NATO also won't stand on our side. What do you think about what he said?
That's right. Let me put it this way. A NATO member country is NATO. Aside from the United States, I group all the remaining countries together. Poland and the 3 Baltic states. Let's set them aside from the rest of the NATO member countries for now. I'm talking about the remaining countries. These countries have been hitching a ride on NATO for their defense for decades. So they've already gotten used to riding without paying for a ticket. It's been like this since their grandfathers. They've been riding without paying. By the time it gets to the grandchildren, they feel like they have every right to it. They think this national defense right is something they're entitled to by default. My grandfather and his generation never paid. It was always the Americans who paid. They were responsible for providing transportation services. America paid our transportation costs. That's just how the world works. Those are the rules. The Americans were willing, and after it became a habit, now they feel that even though it's the Americans who are paying their transportation costs, they saved on transportation costs, but they already spent that money on their own household expenses. Transportation costs are essentially equivalent to national defense. Using transportation costs as an analogy, this money is used to supplement their household income. It's part of their family's daily budget. This money is considered normal income and is spent annually. Simply put, it's social welfare. While they enjoy social welfare and preach to the world that Europe is a welfare state, they are essentially exploiting and plundering America. America used to think, I'm providing you with these transportation costs. You're being offered free rides, so at least you know it's a free ride, right? The Americans don't owe you anything, European countries. It's just that European countries think they're saving money on defense, so they're offering free rides. The US pays for transportation, of course. They use that money to supplement their own income. It's only right that you pay for our family's livelihood. We've never bought tickets for public transport since my grandfather's generation. And now you're reminding me that this bus requires payment, and I'm annoyed. So why do you think you're entitled to this? The question is, as American taxpayers, when we pay taxes, is there a tax category called the Europe tax? Do we owe taxes to European countries? No, we don't owe them anything. As a taxpayer, I also oppose America subsidizing European countries. Why should we have to bear the cost of their social welfare and then have them flaunted in front of us? They say European social welfare is great. Well, if you think it's so great, then pay for it yourself. Don't use foreigners' money to fund your social welfare. It's that simple. Now it's just about getting to the root of the issue. Even among close brothers, accounts should be settled clearly. European countries just can't handle this kind of clear accounting between brothers. If you try to settle accounts with them, they won't acknowledge you as a brother anymore. Even my own eldest brother, I wouldn't recognize him if he didn't show up for the grand finale. This is exactly the current state of Europe. So from this perspective, they are vested interests. Once values get mixed together, this is what comes out. In a certain sense, Russia as a nation is being kept out of sight. For example, Denmark. Denmark signed an agreement with the United States regarding Greenland as early as the early 1950s. The United States has the right to station troops and conduct various activities on Greenland. There is an agreement. The Danish government has an agreement, but the Danish government pretended to forget or not know about it. When the US brought out the original 1951 document, only then did Denmark reluctantly acknowledge it. They started telling the United States about sovereignty, saying that Greenland is their original territory, and then talking about national sovereignty and so on. But you signed an agreement. If that doesn't count as international rules, if the agreement doesn't count, then Denmark, shouldn't you cover the portion of defense expenses that the United States has been paying for you? Logically speaking, you should handle that yourselves. The United States should now withdraw its troops from Europe altogether. Every year, the US supports over 30,000 troops in Europe and has established so many bases there. That's all for the well-being of Europeans, to help them improve their social welfare. The problem is, as the old saying goes, though I've forgotten the exact words, it's like a beggar who comes asking for food and wine, and then ends up living in your house, becoming part of your family. You support him for one generation, then a second, then a third. By the third generation, the beggar's descendants are living in your home as if it's their own. By the time you reach the third generation, he begins to feel that your family is naturally supposed to support him. That is precisely the situation we see in Europe now. Even if everyone behaves in that manner, it is truly not that simple. But they are also members of this global world. You simply cannot reason with them, and they might not listen to anything you say. So what I really want to say is that because of the ongoing US-China Cold War, many flimsy things have been exposed to the light. China's national defense is nothing more than a fragile paper tiger. European countries' national defense is also a tiger, and European values are also a tiger. None of them can withstand any real challenges. The problem is that only the United States has the power to challenge them now, and the United States is using its actions to give China and Europe a series of difficult challenges, which you could say are unintentional. The United States is not intentionally challenging European countries. It is merely dealing with the current international rulemaking process. I cannot allow the power to make rules to fall into the hands of a few reckless and dangerous countries. The so-called reckless countries are totalitarian regimes. These states won't work because the regimes in those countries are completely irrational and unpredictable. The leaders would let the people starve to death rather than allow them to have a voice, just like we see in Iran and China. And there is absolutely no freedom. Protests are met with immediate death. Iran recently killed many people, something no one else in the world has done except the US. If you ask European countries why they haven't condemned Iran, it is because, as I just said, when I peel back the veil, what is revealed is the deeply rooted and complex vested economic interests of European countries, which are already tightly intertwined with those of the Arabs.
There's one more question. I'll be quick since we've gone on for quite a while today. Let me just ask one last question and see if you can give a brief answer. Europe is now trying to build a European NATO because they also realize that the US might gradually withdraw its resources from Europe, so they will have to take on more of their own defense responsibilities. My question is, in this situation, will this force European countries to increase their defense spending, reduce welfare, or perhaps cut back a bit on political correctness, so they can strengthen their own economic, technological, and military capabilities? Is it possible to force them in this way?
I don't think it's possible. Let's talk about the reality first. Right now, when it comes to establishing a European version of NATO, Europe is still stuck. They're still debating whether it's necessary. In other words, whether Europe really needs to establish its own version of NATO. Each country has its own calculations in this matter. For example, what France is thinking is, how can France use this opportunity to revive its national defense industry? Meanwhile, other European countries, especially those in Southern Europe, are thinking, can we do it? In this ongoing debate, some are simply ignoring the idea altogether. What does a European version of NATO even mean to them? So, as the debate over necessity drags on endlessly, this is the situation in Europe. Dragging things out is really their specialty. They could keep arguing for 20 years. So the next question is about feasibility studies. Is it possible? Is it doable? The conclusion is that it's impossible. Which European country right now could cut social welfare by 10%? If any political party dared to propose such a slogan, and if this slogan could actually win votes and get that party elected, then you could use this as an example. This example would prove that rebuilding Europe and opposing NATO is feasible, at least in one country, is possible. But the problem is, we haven't seen any European country that has been able to do this. A courageous party leader who puts forward this slogan, people talk about Europe every day. Why is there a European version of NATO? That is a matter of so-called necessity in political discourse. It's like saying, should we build an extra rain shelter on the roof of our house? You could discuss this for a lifetime, for 3 generations, whether it's necessary or not. In any case, it doesn't really make a difference. You live in this house, but when it comes to whether it's necessary, who pays for it? Then the eldest, the second, and the third start discussing, and the 3 daughters-in-law will all have their own opinions too. And in the end, our family currently, for now, just doesn't have the money. Then after my son grows up, we'll see how things go, right? So this is just a feasibility study. Europe hasn't even entered the feasibility study stage yet. So now, whenever I see this kind of news, I just glance at the headline and move on, because I'm very familiar with the tricks they play. It's just the usual tricks that the European Parliament is best at, endless discussions and bickering. Even the US Secretary of State knows this now. He also said there would be minor, if any, proposals. As for these European bureaucrats, in fact, the EU itself is just the world's largest bureaucratic institution. Aside from making bureaucratic rules, they don't do anything useful, nor are they capable of doing anything useful.